Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's event, which is a launch of Paul Richards and Perri Six's book about Mary Douglas. In fact, their second book about Mary Douglas, which they're going to be introducing to us. I'll start off by thanking the RAI and Bear Khan and various people who've come along to speak and listen, but I won't go on at length about that because I've had a preview of what Paul and Perri are going to say, and there won't be a dry eye in the house if the thanks go on as long as anticipated. So anyway, but thank you everyone for the efforts in that regard. In order to keep myself on time, I've actually written down what I mean to say unusually. So I'll start by saying we've got three distinguished authors with us this afternoon, and possibly four if Mary's bet on eternity was more accurate than some of the rest of us in the room. In the case of the co-authors presenting, I tell you what, is the second book about Mary Douglas's theories, I've asked them to do two things for us. It goes without saying to talk us through a book about Mary Douglas appearing in a series with the word ancestors in its title, but also to ask what the point is of making ancestors. I don't know of a typology of ancestors, but offhand I can think of three types of ancestors. Ancestors who are simply forebears and who will be forgotten or survive only as names. Ancestors who are frankly embarrassing, about whom we would rather forget, but we either won't or shouldn't be allowed to. And ancestors who handed down something we should remember because we can use it constructively. So if Paul talks about the continuities between his own work and Douglas's, and Perri outlines a transdisciplinary short tradition of research into knowledge and environmental issues, this is because I invited them to demonstrate the continuing relevance of this ancestor's ideas, not because they came here to bang their own drums. So let's start with our two authors and our reviewer, who will speak afterwards. Paul Richards' long career has taken him from geography to anthropology, from universities in Britain, Holland, and Sierra Leone, UCL to Wageningen to Njala, to mention a few. And from, quote, indigenous agricultural revolutions, his phrase to emphasize the significance and also the undervaluation of farmers' knowledge in development plans, through the role of disaffected and disenfranchised youth in the Sierra Leone civil wars, to that of local communities and their informed practices in the Ebola pandemic. Over time, he gravitated increasingly towards neo-Durkheimian theories of the kind Mary Douglas developed, though not, I think, from the same direction as she did. The convergence has arisen on his side from investigating the causes of apparently irreconcilable disagreements, the marginalization and disparagement of local knowledge, and in these contexts, the potential of moving together in reconciliation, typically in what anthropologists call ritual, but analogously to the collaboration of making music or patterns of dance. These are interests that I think reflect late more than early Douglas writings, but Paul's at liberty to disagree with me in a few moments. Perri Six is a social and political scientist who's enjoyed a varied career that has led him from political consultancy for policy institutes and lobby groups via a half dozen university appointments. As I was coming in, I could sort of imagine the tour T-shirt with all the universities listed down the back and the date of the gigs. Finally, to a chair in public management at Queen Mary, from which he retired very recently. His substantive written output should convince Jacob Rees-Mogg that work from home can be productive. But his theoretical writings explain cogently why this happy outcome is institutionally implausible. For those not joining us from Britain, I should point out this is a right-wing politician who was then latterly a government minister and thought it was a really good idea, never mind a pandemic and never mind train strikes, that everyone go back to their offices to be more productive. Anyway, I'm sure you can put him straight on that one. His writings on cultural bias, this is Perri, not Jacob Rees-Mogg. His writings on cultural bias, opportunism, collaboration, political judgment, and a long list of other matters where academic and public interests overlap are extensive and incisive. He has kindly consented this afternoon to select from amongst these many subjects those most likely to engage anthropologists, who probably make up a majority of our audience. Turning now to Gillian Tett. In 3 decades since her Cambridge PhD in social anthropology, awarded of course at an implausibly young age, Gillian Tett has become anthropology's standard-bearing public intellectual. She's found time to join us from the US, where I hope she has anyway, honey. I mean, I don't see her here, but
not yet.
Not yet. Okay, she will, not having heard this, find time to join us from the US, where she chairs the editorial board and writes a weekly column for the Financial Times. This month, if I'm to believe what I read, she has taken up her appointment as Provost of King's College back in Cambridge. Her ethnographic analysis of actors, networks, and events in the run-up to the spectacular collapse of the derivatives market came out in 2009, almost contemporaneously with the fallout and the crisis itself, rather than a decade later, as would befit a public inquiry. That would be a quick public inquiry, or I suppose most academic accounts of what had happened. Her combination of a journalist's accessible style and an anthropological brain is as evident in her more recent book, Anthrovision, which should be read at any age, but particularly by 16-year-olds, which, if I can be allowed a personal reflection, was the age at which I read J.K. Galbraith's The Affluent Society and decided to study economics. Galbraith's book was already a decade old by then, but the invitation to look beyond conventional wisdom had aged well. It would be a better informed world in a few years' time if it was run by young people who were told how very readable Gillian Tett is. With those introductions over, I'm going to hand over to Paul and invite him to give us his introduction to this work, and then seamlessly Perri will take over and introduce the book from his perspective. So thanks both of you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I just have to explain that I'm recovering from pneumonia, and so I tend to squeak. But I'll drink water if I squeak too much. Also, I'm a bit amazed by Richard's introduction, because we wrote out our introduction so we could keep to time. And then he said, no, don't do that. That's not right. He said, improvise. It'd be much nicer if you improvise. So I abandoned the introduction, and I'm now going to improvise.
It was supposed to make time for you to improvise.
Yeah, right. Of course. So I've done a bit of work on improvisation, and one of the problems with improvisation is improvisers are very slow to get going, but they're almost impossible to stop. So I'm sure, Richard, you will tell me when my time is up, and I will then cease, if I haven't already ceased squeaking too much. What I wanted to do in the written out introduction, and some of you have seen it, is to say a little bit about why I think Mary's project didn't really take off in the way it should have done, and why our book is an attempt to, shall we say, rehabilitate it. But I first probably need to give an indication of what Mary meant by institution. She saw institutions as being the heart of anthropology, or the heart of social theory. But institutions were not quite as the economists tell us institutions are. For the economists, institutions are instruments of rationality. They're capable of a scientific model-based explanation. But Mary saw institutions in a different way. She saw them as ways that we use to represent to each other ways of working or ways of existing in social groups. And one of the ways that they work, she argued, was by becoming invisible. So we're not conscious of our institutions. If we're conscious of our institutions, in the sense that the World Bank and other economic institutions hope that they're changing institutions within, shall we say, Africa, they think that that's a technical job, and you can explain how the institution works and how the best types of institutions should be in place and the worst types of institutions should be removed. Mary will have none of that, because she says an institution won't work unless it becomes invisible. It has to become part of your life. It's in the nature of things, is how she claimed that humans see institutions. They become second nature. And that's consequential in her argument. So we'll get on to that in a moment. But just to say, in very brief summary, that she thought that the elements of institutions were universal, but the combinations that you got in different communities, in different historical contexts, in different societies, were quite specific to those societies. And the way that institutions combine, it's a very complex task to analyze how they become bolted together, how they become functional for the particular group that defends or lives by those institutions. And so she thought that you couldn't actually do an external critique of institutions because they were too complex, they were too individual to the groups that held those institutional beliefs. And that in the end, if you want reform, it has to come from within rather than without. And this is where she differs from the, shall we call it, the standard theory of institutions that you get in economics and political science and so on. So the way the different elements of institutions across the globe are bundled varies. So that's why institutional analysis is difficult, because institutions are inescapable. And we judge institutions from our own institutional standpoint. That's the other big issue that she draws to our attention, that there's no level playing field. We can't say that we have a perspective from which we can judge other institutions because our own institutionalization is part of how we judge institutions. So this leads to a tendency to what Gillian Tett, in the book you didn't mention, Richard, describes as a silo effect. And others have talked about people talking in bubbles, internet bubbles and so on. So we're beginning to be familiar with the phenomenon that Mary was interested in analysing. It's this idea that we live in institutional bubbles. It's part of the human condition, and it's not a simple task by any means to penetrate those institutions, even to understand where they're coming from and how they're put together. So let me now say briefly what I would have said if I'd read out my prepared statement. I would have argued that the difficult, and still do argue, that the difficulty that we have in appreciating what Douglas did was because it's very easy to misread some of her early work, and her later work is actually quite difficult to understand if you've not grasped where she was trying to get to. And I think a lot of people didn't at the time really appreciate what her argument was. So the problem with the early work is it was too successful. Purity and Danger is one of the best-selling social anthropology books of all time. It outstrips anything written by Marshall Sahlins or anything written by Sir Edmund Leach in terms of citations. What it doesn't outstrip is Clifford Geertz's, I always forget the name of the damn book, so I'm going to have to read my notes. Interpretation of Cultures, which was a sort of compendium of his essays. It was published in 1973, but the essays were being published during the 1960s, so they're contemporary, exactly contemporary with Purity and Danger. What Mary does in Purity and Danger is she pays a lot of attention to her peers. So she uses a lot of the material, the best material that was coming out of deep immersion anthropology in Africa, Asia, and Latin America at that period, sort of classic ethnographic studies. She uses that to bolster her argument. And it's clear that the reason she's doing that is she fears that she's going to be seen as a woman, as a young woman especially, as a sort of interloper in this very male-dominated field, and she wants to make sure that they feel fully incorporated in her argument. But the net result is that I think you read that book and think, aha, this is what Clifford Geertz meant by thick description. The point is that Mary didn't, she was not much interested in ethnography for its own sake. She thought it was the empirical bedrock of understanding of institutions, but she was going in a different direction. So she'll have none of Clifford Geertz's idea that humans are suspended in webs of cultural meaning and so forth. What she's really after is understanding causality in terms of institutions. And what she decides, following or inspired by Durkheim, she decides that it's human interaction, human action and human interaction that generates institutionalization. And institutionalization is the outcome. So the way we put it in the book is that Mary separates the X and the Y variables, and this brings her into the terrain of the econometricians and so on who are working on the standard theory of institutions, because they often describe their activity as an X causes Y type of explanatory framework. And so that allows Mary to claim that she's part of social science. She's quite insistent on that. And that, unlike Geertz, who thought that social anthropology was not a science, it was a humanities, it was an interpretive discipline, she was going in a completely different direction. And there are various byways and things that disrupted her program along the way, which we explain in the book. But she ends up with the first clear exposition of what she's trying to argue in a book which comes quite late in her career, How Institutions Think. But the second point I make in my written out introduction is that How Institutions Think is not adequate on its own as a full exposition of her theory. You also need a long paper she wrote in a book of essays in honor of the philosopher Nelson Goodman, Rightness of Categories. And that's quite a tough read. You know, I must have read it 10 times before I even began to understand what she was talking about, because a lot of what really counts in that paper comes very much late on. It's about 15,000 words, Perri, 10 to 15,000 words. And it's only in the last third of the paper that you really begin to get a sense of where she's going, because that's where she starts to modestly add in the elements that are not in the thinking of Nelson Goodman and the other philosophers that have all taken us to this point. So she's going through Nelson Goodman, she's going through Thomas Kuhn and others, the sociologists of science, David Bloor and others. She goes through all that in meticulous detail and then gets to her own key elements at the end. So if you're still awake by the end, you've got the point, but otherwise, I think a lot of people have sort of dropped off by that point. And in any case, there's no instruction that says this article must be read with How Institutions Think, otherwise you won't get the full picture. So that's basically what we try and do in our book, to repair the vehicle that's stranded by the side of the road and bring it back into functionality and to drive it along further. But of course, then Richard said, well, that's fine, he said, but you don't actually say why this vehicle is worth rehabilitating. You lovingly repaired it, making a YouTube video to show how you found an old motorbike in the bush and you've managed to make it work again, kind of thing. But why? Of course, with the motorbike, it's because you want to ride it and show off. But in the case of Mary Douglas, I think to both of us, she was absolutely central to unlocking the major empirical problems that we were grappling with at the time we first read How Institutions Think. I was trying to work out when I read it, and there's not much evidence in my copy of the book, which is hanging on together by its last bits of glue. It's been gone through at least 10 times, judging by the different marker pen colours and notes I've written down the side in different inks and even different styles of handwriting as I've got older. But I think I must have read it about 1990. And the civil war in Sierra Leone started in 1991. And that was a big shock to my system. You know, up until that point, I've been using, as it were, conventional anthropological explanations of how people resolve conflicts at a local level, how life works, what we've missed out. Richard's made the point that I wrote a book about how peasant knowledge of agriculture and agricultural organization has been undervalued. And it would be good to put that back into general circulation. But I got no idea of what was coming in the Civil War. The problem with that Civil War was that no one could explain it. It was beyond the Cold War, so you couldn't line it up in terms of Marxist conflict against capitalism or anti-colonial struggle, anything like that. To many commentators, the Civil War in Sierra Leone from 1991 to 2002 seemed to be just like elemental barbarity. The only explanation that commentators in the newspapers, in the international debating fora could come up with was the idea that this war was mindless savagery, and it must be a manifestation of something elemental evil. I can name names, but I won't, of the BBC commentators, some of them still around. I can hear their sonorous tones as they would show that they were not these kinds of people, that they had standards, they believed in human rights, but these barbarians were, well, basically they were animaline. And that's what I had to try and deal with in my own explanation of what was happening in the country and explaining that war. And it was very difficult, because as soon as you start to try and explain the rationality of the thing, then you get accused of being a rebel sympathizer or an apologist for extreme violence or whatever. What I realized from reading Mary was that actually you could have an explanation of her kind that doesn't involve you in staking out a claim on the high moral ground. You can simply park your own assumptions, as it were, and start to deal with the operational realities of how institutions are being formed and reformed under extreme pressure. 5 minutes or 3 minutes? And the explanation that I came up with, building on what Mary had given me, was that we needed to look at what had happened with the process of so-called abolition of slavery in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone is a country that has for 500 years been a product of the Atlantic slave trade. And so a lot of local institutions had been aligned with the values of the international slave traders. Commerce in Sierra Leone was learned through the slave trade. It wasn't learned through Adam Smith and buying and selling and the benign effects of the hidden hand. It was raw violence in which people were literally being seized and enslaved and shipped overseas and never to be seen again. And after the slave trade was ended, long and complicated story we needn't go into, but Sierra Leone as a political foundation was British government trying to set up a home for freed slaves and so on in West Africa. But the interior districts around Sierra Leone had come up with a kind of hybrid system of self-emancipation. So chiefs were very powerful, they're former warlords, they've been enslaving people themselves, and they had lots of dependents, and they tried to make use of the local family system to reintegrate those dependents, but still they were slaves in the sense that they didn't own their own land, they didn't get paid, and so on and so forth. And the British then prolonged this during the First World War because they needed carriers in the African campaigns in Cameroon and Tanganyika, and they recruited extensively in Sierra Leone. But they went into the country districts and they asked the paramount chiefs, who were these slave holders, could they supply the labour? And the answer was yes, because they've got lots of slaves. British government said, look, disgraceful that we recruit a lot of slaves into the British Army, so we're going to free them. And then the chief said, no, we're not going to give away our slaves. So the deal that was done was that they could be free while they were serving the British Army in other parts of Africa, but as soon as they came home, they reverted to being slaves. And this gave us a social context of conflict within society that continued into the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and the beginning of the Civil War. There never, ever really been any proper emancipation of the slaves in Sierra Leone. And but people had bodged together institutional elements that sort of fitted. At least it kept the peace and people got fed, and even the children of slaves went to school and so on. So there seemed to be a general improvement. But you had an institutional landscape that at any moment could fly apart into its constituent elements. And Douglas gave me the constituent elements. All I had to do essentially was to go and interview people or make observations in the field, and I could identify the different, what she calls isolate ordering, hierarchical ordering, market-based ordering, and enclave ordering. And I could literally see, as it happened, these elements fly apart. And then they started to reinforce themselves within their own new identity, their isolated identity or their enclaved identity and so on. And the feedback processes that we write about in the book, that Douglas latterly became part of her theory, a central part of her theory, those processes were reinforcing a kind of institutional collapse. So the more that people tried to strengthen for their survival their own institutionalization, the more they came into conflict with each other, to the point where they ended up in indescribable atrocities and violence and so on and so forth. But it was clear that to deal with the situation, you then had to do something like Douglas had been arguing, which was you had to find some way in which these different institutionalizations could speak to each other. And we worked hard with conflict resolution agencies who were prepared to take on board some of this. My late colleague, Stephen Archibald, he and I wrote a paper for Richard for Africa, which kind of had the elements of the theory. And a lot of that actually had come from the ground. By that stage, I was ostracized in the academic community because I was alleged to be a rebel supporter and an apologist for extreme atrocity and so on. And Steve Archibald was the one that kind of forced me back into the field and into academic work on this topic, because he said, Paul, I keep on going to these international conferences where I hear you being denounced. And he said, then I helicopter into the middle of the war zone in Sierra Leone. And what I hear around me, people who've never read your book or heard about anything at all to do with Mary Douglas, but they keep on talking the sorts of things that are in your book. So he said, we're going to implement this. We're going to make the peace program learn the lessons of what Douglas was talking about in terms of institutionalization. So I think I'll leave it at that point. I do have some acknowledgements I want to make, and can I quickly read them, just simply because I want to end by thanking my collaborators. And first, I want to thank my co-author, Perri. He and I have developed a remarkably rapid and fruitful way of working together. He wrote and I rewrote our previous book on Mary Douglas, and I wrote and he rewrote this one, all in weeks rather than months. It is in the expansion of argument through rewriting that shared meanings and values arise. By what chemistry we do this and so rapidly baffles me, but I'm grateful for the experience. I'm also extremely grateful for the support of Richard Fardon. Not only do we lean heavily in places in our book on his all-important scholarly work on Douglas, but he's also a remarkably rapid, generous and helpful reviewer. I would also like to thank Gillian Tett for her strong support. She and I have yet to meet in person, but we met virtually over her wonderful book, Anthrovision, and she's since been most encouraging on this book when encouragement was most needed. Finally, I would also like to thank our publisher, Marian Berghan, for daring to commission a second book from us on Mary Douglas, given the modest, well, that's putting it lightly, modest sales performance of our previous effort. I hope her continuing confidence in us is now better rewarded.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you for doing exactly what I thought might be helpful.
Yeah, and you had to stop me because improvisers go on forever.
But both to give us an outline of what the book was about, why you and Perri felt it worthwhile to write a second book about Mary Douglas, and for anyone who wasn't clear about the applicability of the theory, an extended case study to show why the theory works. So Perri's going to speak next. One of the things that maybe you could pick up if you were sort of going freestyle a little bit, like Paul, would be to tell us a bit more about the 4 types of institutionalization that Paul listed, but for those not familiar with the work, didn't go into the details of what the 4 types are.
There is a diagram in the book.
There's a surprise. Yeah, okay, but that might be helpful for people who are listening in but are unfamiliar with the work. So Perri, over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you all of you for joining us today, and for all of you who've joined us online on Zoom. We do appreciate it very much, and I would like to add my thanks to the RAI and to Hanin for all the generosity in hosting us today. Mary was, of course, very proud to be associated with this institution, and indeed, I do have to add my thanks to Marian Berghan. I don't know if she's able to join us online.
She is online.
Oh, I'm delighted to hear it. For Richard, I have to say, of course, our book serves as a kind of amuse-bouche for his major 1999 biography. And I'm very grateful to Gillian Tett for joining us today. And I will say something later about how I think Douglas's arguments may be relevant to the kinds of things that she spent the last 25 years writing about. It's been both a delight and an honour to work with someone as distinguished as Paul. I, as a non-anthropologist, regard his achievements in studying Sierra Leone as among, well, surely the profoundest and most thoughtful applications and extensions of her work in the anthropological literature. So it has been a great honour to work with him. Paul set out why Douglas' work matters for anthropology today and for understanding some of our contemporary travails and afflictions. I'd like to stand back from that and say something about Douglas's unique and I think very powerful contribution to the anthropology of knowledge. That required her to engage in debates with the philosophy of anthropology and the philosophy of the social sciences. When Douglas was working, philosophy of anthropology and philosophy of social science was not just central to what anthropologists were doing. It was hugely central to the whole philosophical endeavor of the Western tradition, to philosophy of language and philosophy of meaning. And Douglas, I think, made a distinctively anthropological contribution to those debates. In the second half of the 20th century, a lot of that anthropology of knowledge, the study of how our social organization shapes how we think, really alarmed a certain set of philosophers who got into a great panic about relativism. And for many philosophers, the great boo word of relativism meant not just the inevitable plurality in how we think. It meant somehow a denial of the notion that there are facts about how the world is. Douglas debated this very issue with the philosopher John Skorupski in 1979. I think we can describe this as a completely failed conversation because they managed to talk past each other entirely. I don't think she actually grappled with his philosophical concerns and he just didn't get the anthropological argument. In that year, of course, David Bloor published his book, Knowledge and Social Imagery, in its first edition, and Douglas and Bloor had been in touch. And what she took from Bloor, and this becomes very evident in her later work, but it's already there, I think, even in Natural Symbols in 1970. She argues, as Bloor had called it, the symmetry principle, that we have to give the same kind of explanation for people's false beliefs and for their true beliefs. We can't just give one kind of explanation for the beliefs that we dislike and that we wish to reject, and a completely different one for the ones that we approve of. Now, Bloor was arguing that from a philosophy of science point of view, which was why his book was a great scandal to many scientists. But what Douglas brought to this was a distinctive causal mechanism. How is it that the elementary forms, Durkheim's phrase, of social organization will cultivate distinctive styles of thought? And in How Institutions Think, 1986, and the 1992 article Rightness of Categories, Douglas provides her central mechanism. She argues, and this is the anthropologist's contribution to the philosopher's debate, that it is ritual which does this. Now, by ritual, she understands, as all of you as anthropologists would understand, but political scientists still fail to, she understood that it referred to the informal, the quotidian interaction ritual, as Goffman was describing it by the 1960s. Not just grand public ceremonial, but etiquette, conversation, the way we conduct meetings, even as I've argued, genres of administrative writing and genres of writing, diplomatic notes or something. This is the mechanism by which we dance our social organization into peculiar styles of thought. And one of the things that she does to develop this is to engage, without even naming him, with the famous argument of the philosopher Willard Quine in his 1960 book Word and Object, which was an argument he fought with anthropologists. And in his famous Gavagai argument, Quine claimed to say, well, you can't just point at something and that will remove all ambiguity. Well, do you mean rabbit? Do you mean lunch? Do you mean running? Douglas thought, this idea that we can't disambiguate, that you either have the whole system or not at all, is a nonsense. It's a nonsense about how anthropologists learn from informants. It's a nonsense about how children learn. It's a nonsense about how social organization gets going and how we recruit people to anything. Her argument is that in the ritual context between teacher and learner, anthropologist and informant, in the ritual context of child and adult, ostension takes part of a ritual process by which we dance ourselves into disambiguity. And she finds in Kuhn's later work, not the structure of scientific revolutions, which everybody reads once and then never reads again, but his later work on scientific pedagogy, she shows that the use of ritual performance of exemplars is exactly the same in the teaching of science as the lay were doing to bring up their children and to cultivate the sustaining of the pangolin cult. She says in the reflections on the 1970s essays at the very end of her collection Implicit Meanings in the second edition, that it was the historian of political thought, Quentin Skinner, then at Cambridge, who directed her to read the philosopher Nelson Goodman. And this put her in touch with David Hull and various other philosophers of science. And what she took from Goodman was what he describes at the beginning of Ways of World Making as radical relativism, but under rigorous restraints. So what she's able to show in Rightness of Categories is that the plurality of our styles of thought, the irreconcilable multiplicity, but a limited multiplicity because there's a limited number of elementary forms by which human beings can organize, actually explains not just different styles of judgment, but she can show, and these are the rigorous restraints, the costs of wrongness of categories. There are facts of the matter about risks, as well as inevitable but limited plurality. In How Institutions Think, what Douglas does is shift the argument about how the anthropology or sociology of knowledge works. Right from Mannheim, it had been preoccupied with explaining what people think. Douglas makes this crucial move to saying, no, what we can really do with this, which is much more important, is show how people think with whatever propositions they may believe or not believe. She argues that the substantive content of the propositions of our beliefs is much less important than how our social organization enables us to use whatever beliefs, if any, we might have. Researchers have got to ask, what do people use beliefs for? And in her work on consumption, for example, with Baron Isherwood, this is exactly what she does. She doesn't ask, what do people believe about goods? What propositions? She asks, if we have beliefs at all about the things that we want to conceive? What do we use those beliefs for? And she did the same with her work on environmental and technological risk, on the role of blame in conflict, on her work in the 1980s when she was in America on religious doubt and skepticism, and the same again, which I'll come back to in a moment, on conflict resolution in her great, well, she called it fieldwork in the Bible, in ancient Israel. So she argues that what matters and what really requires explanation is the ritual cultivation of ways of using beliefs. And that's what I think has inspired so many of the now hundreds of people who have given papers at the annual Mary Douglas seminar have focused on a seminar which I organised in 2010 with Gerald Mars, a very distinguished anthropologist, and which has run for now 15 years and spans every discipline from film studies to anthropology, from development studies to technology, from political science to psychology. And the point here, of course, is that people who are committed to the very same propositions will use them in utterly different ways, depending on how they're organised. So what Douglas can then do, of course, is turn the tables on those philosophers who are in their great panic about relativism. Because in her work on religious sects and religious skeptics in the 1980s, and even in her very last book, Thinking in Circles, published in 2007, she's able to actually explain why people adopt relativism as a position itself, and skepticism. It's a social practice cultivated under very particular forms of informal institutions, which spring up in reaction to other forms of institutions. So we argue in this book that this approach is not just novel and provocative, it's not just deeply rooted in anthropology's core concepts, it's programmatic for a neo-Durkheimian approach across the social sciences, but it ought to be taken up again in anthropology. To take the fields that Gillian Tett has worked on so intensively in recent years, it would tell us much more about how people in the operations departments of major banks and insurance companies and shadow banks work and why they cannot agree with their internal compliance teams or with their regulators. It's not that they disagree about propositions, it's that they're differently organised. Now, the poor old Financial Conduct Authority, God help them, has got themselves worked up about some academic work done in business schools, which says, oh, it's all down to your strong or weak risk culture. I think Douglas would have snorted at that. All that stuff says, oh, well, we should look at their values. Values are completely irrelevant here. It's actually how the operations people and compliance people are organised, which cultivates them to use particular values differently. Now, there's a sort of Gödel's theorem about how we classify the world. All of our classifications will throw up anomalies, inconsistencies, ambiguities. Douglas argues beyond that. She says, well, there's only a limited number of ways in which we can manage anomalies. What can we do with them? And this goes to your question, Richard. Under particular kinds of organisation, we might be cultivated, well, we've got an anomaly, let's create another special rule for it. But no, you can adjust. And the problem with that, of course, is you then end up with the most rococo set of rules, because every time you've got an anomaly, you've got more rules. What else can we do? Well, we can debar anomalies. They're appalling. They're abominations. This has the advantage of the simple clarity of principle, but of course it produces the risk of acute rigidity and of rejection. What else can we do? Well, Douglas argues under very different sorts of social organisation, we could say an anomaly, oh great, that's an opportunity, I can exploit that. There's a business to be made there, for example, or there's an academic article to be published or something. There are chances for brokering advantage. But the risk is, of course, when we're seen and known as somebody who just exploits anomalies for our own advantage, that we undermine our own credibility. Finally, what else can we do? Well, we can cope. We can just put up with anomalies, because life's full of them. You just accept the unavoidable set of anomalies. And Douglas argues, recasting Durkheim's two concepts of how institutions are organized, social integration and social regulation, that when we cross-tabulate these and attend not to what's at the apices of those dimensions, as Durkheim did in Le Suicide, but to the cells, then we can see why these different ways of organizing anomalies work. Now, why does this matter? So 1987, Douglas goes back to the Lele in the Congo. Of course, by this stage, many are in Kinshasa, much smaller communities on the left bank of the Kansai now. And of course, this is Mobutu's period, and a lot of the social organization is broken down. But what she finds is extraordinary violence and devastation from an anti-sorcery cult, which has been mobilized with the backing of the Catholic Church, her own church. Shocked by this. I mean, it's not such a shock. She's known of the anti-sorcery obsessions back in the 40s and 50s, but this level of violence and destruction, which had been brought upon, was way over and above anything that we've seen then, or indeed that the Mobutu regime had carried out. And it led her to devote a lot more thought to the ways in which, once we deal with anomalies, for example, by debarring them, as the anti-sorcery cult had done, what we do is generate positive feedback. A dynamic, for example, in sectarian enclave settings, which she now finally understood was what Durkheim had in mind by sacred contagion. And it's not just positive feedback in the sense that the economists understand it, network effects, and they stabilize. No, Douglas argues it's actually self-disorganizing, and that was the catastrophe of the Lele people in the 1980s. And it also provokes a backlash, negative feedback from other forms of organizing, where people will deal with anomalies differently. So anomalies, or rather, more precisely, the social organization of how we use anomalies, becomes central to her whole understanding of social change and conflict. And then, in her final works, using her field work, as she called it, in the Bible, she taught herself ancient Hebrew. She explores the ways in which institutions might find ways to manage anomalies that could contain conflict, that could accommodate different ways of managing anomalies, and perhaps calm the fury of sacred contagion. Richard famously called Douglas the faithful disciple of Durkheim. We argue in this book that much more than this. In her argument about explaining how people think, Douglas comprehensively resynthesized Durkheim's core concepts, specifying a limited plurality of elementary forms of organizing by which ritually we cultivate styles of thought which can go to extremes, but can also clash and undermine each other. And as Philip Smith's recent book on the Durkheimian traditions has argued, we argue too that Douglas' work is today one of the most fertile of all the Durkheimian traditions, and as such, perhaps 20th century British anthropology's greatest contribution to the social sciences, and a programme that really ought to be revitalised.
Thanks very much, Perri, and thanks for keeping to your 20 minutes. Much appreciated. Before we move on, what are we now agreeing to call this body of theory? Not cultural theory, because that was dreadfully misleading because it got mixed up with Clifford Geertz. Not grid and group, because everyone got rather fed up with yes, and everyone started making silly puns on that one. So I'll let that one go. Are we in neo-Durkheimianism? Is that where we're? Is that?
I've always called it neo-Durkheimian institutional theory. It's a mouthful. Yeah. Mary hated it, but it has the advantage of accuracy, I think.
Okay. Paul, yes?
Well, I think we tend to, Perri and I have shifted a little bit in our terminology, and in recent exchanges, we tend to call it Douglasian institutional theory. Which
Right. So we have a classificatory problem.
Yes,
Which might throw up
anomalies.
Yes, okay, good. Plenty to go on with here. So we'll come back to Perri and Paul later, and if there are questions on the floor, we can ask them to develop other case studies that to their mind show the fertility of this way of looking at social dramas, events, problems, and so on and so forth. But I think, Haneen, you can now call up Gillian, Tett, who I can see postage size stamp size at the top of my screen at the moment. I imagine you can enlarge her.
Yes,
hi, hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Well, first of all, I should check. Can you hear me okay?
Very well, thank you. Yes,
See.
I believe you missed my introduction to you.
I did, and I'm sorry, but I
I
don't
was
know.
enormously flattering. You won't have to blush.
Good.
Can I hand over to you then, Gillian?
Yeah, you definitely do not need to repeat it because I know who I am. And I'd probably be more embarrassed if I heard whatever you said. The fact you can see me so big means you can see how exhausted I am with bags under my eyes. As you may know, I have just arrived in Cambridge University, where I have the privilege of becoming provost of King's College. And that is why I can't be with you right now, because I have literally landed into a complete whirlwind of bureaucratic administration. And I was chuckling to myself when I heard Perri's comments about how institutions run through rituals and etiquette and conversational styles and the way we conduct meetings, because I'm frankly plunged into which is radically different from what I've been used to in the last years. And I think your comments ring very, very true indeed. Can I just double check? Can you still hear me fine? Can you just wave at me if you can?
Yes, can hear you fine. You're
My
ever so slightly hanging for a second or two sometimes, but nothing too serious.
Sorry, thank you. Well, another culture shock for me has been how unstable the Wi-Fi is. I'm on the official University of Cambridge Wi-Fi system, which keeps glitching. So apologies. And if it does glitch, do just sort of, I'll try and get back in quickly. I do feel like an interloper because I am not an academic anthropologist today. I'm an amateur anthropologist. My main role in this whole thing has been to try and popularize some anthropology ideas in my writing as a journalist in recent years. And so everything I say with great humility, recognizing that you guys are the experts. And, I'm basically just learning from you and being provoked into new ways of thinking. Having said that, I really want to make 2 or 3 points. The first is that I first reacquainted myself with the works of Mary Douglas, and through that with Orwell and Perri, not in relation to financial institutions, as Perri has highlighted, although I'll come back to that, but actually in relation to COVID and the pandemic. Because I have to think that Mary Douglas's framework about, the sacred and the pure, and her framework around dirt and medical risk was absolutely invaluable during the pandemic in trying to make sense of what was going on. In particular, her point about xenophobia and how you always, assume that there's much more risk from outsiders than at home during pandemics, and pandemics tend to create more xenophobia, rang very, very true in relation to what was happening in America at the time, which is where I was living, where essentially you had Donald Trump whipping up hysteria about the Chinese virus, the ultimate form of xenophobia, but being so unbelievably lax inside his own domestic space that, as we all know, the entire White House got COVID. Not that different in some ways to what was happening with Boris Johnson in number 10 at the time. And I was very struck by the applications of Mary Douglas in relation to that, and doubly so by getting to know Paul and his incredibly important work in relation to and the whole saga there, which I incorporated into my own book. And I spent much of the post-pandemic period and the pandemic period just wishing that more policymakers had actually taken the time to look at the work of Mary Douglas, because it had very, very practical, immediate impact for policymaking and medical policy messaging. And that also they had learned the lesson about Ebola and West Africa from people like Paul. And as I wrote in my book Anthrovision, the parallels between what happened with that epidemic, not pandemic, and COVID, and the appalling tragedy of missed lessons or missed opportunities in terms of not learning the lessons from that experience and applying it to COVID, even though it was sitting under their noses, and even though the man who was in charge of managing the British Ebola response later went on to run the COVID response, the tragedy of that missed opportunity was absolutely enormous. So that convinced me of the importance of both Mary Douglas's work, but also the work of Perri and Paul in terms of shaping the policy debate, the messaging debate, and how we imagine risk and how we think about the intersection of institutions. But I think in many ways, what we're looking at today is even more relevant, or makes their work even more relevant in a very practical policy area. I say that partly because of the question about financial risks and financial institutions that Perri pointed to so clearly in relation to the FCA and all the efforts to try and reform policy making and the way that banks behave since 2007. And I strongly agree with him that the issue right now is not so much just about what people think or what the official rule books are inside institutions. It's also about how they actually think, how processes are actually transmitted, and how institutions define risk or do not define risk in their everyday operations. I think that's absolutely critical. But I think also because there is a much wider crisis in Western democracy today about how government works and what civil society actually means. The only possible silver lining of the horrors of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that it has forced people in the West to wake up and realize that they cannot take democracy and civil society and their institutions for granted. And that has dovetailed with a sense of absolute disgust, if not spread mistrust amongst the public in institutions and in policymaking. All the polls you look at about how people regard the pillars of civil society and public life show a real collapse of trust, rising frustration in institutions, and at the same time, an explosion of polarization and, frankly, hatred, tribal hatred between different parts of society in the West as well. Again, coming from America, and I've now landed in Cambridge, but coming from America, the polls on the level of mutual distrust and hatred between the Republicans and Democrats and the rise of extremism and the degree to which institutions are now being treated as a battleground politically between the two sides right now is quite astonishing. So I say all that because to pick up again on a point that both of you made, there's huge focus on what people think in different parties. There's very little discussion, as you say, about how they think. And there's even less discussion about how we can actually take institutions as they currently exist and mindfully make them more effective, able to uphold, frankly, better able to see risks, be it COVID, be it finance or anything else going forward. So a long-winded way of saying that I strongly applaud the work you've been doing. I very much hope it finds a wider audience. I very much hope that its messages are really teased out and applied in a very practical way, not just to the question of medical risk, and no one should think that we're over the pandemic and that's the end of it all, that the points that you made in your work coming years, but also to financial risk. But I'd leave you with this one last great thought, which is, to my mind, one of the other great areas where you could now is in a
Sorry,
of
could you just
risk,
repeat that bit, please,
which
Gillian? We lost it in a
deeply
long
which is
stutter.
cyber, where we have developed
Gillian, if you can hear me, can you
Can you
just
hear me now?
take two on the last three sentences, please?
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can. I think about three
Yeah.
sentences.
Can you
we
hear
might
me
have
now?
forgot. Yes, I can hear you now. I think we missed about three
Okay.
sentences.
Okay, I'm going to turn off my video and see if it makes it better. Okay.
Yeah.
My last point really is this, that in relation to cyber risk, in my mind, the issues that stalking the world, think there's any way to use some of the insights in relation to cyber risks and how suited within institutions and the type of classification around them as well. So that was all I was going to say. Thank you very much indeed for including me. And I look forward to hearing what the proper academic expert anthropologists have to say next.
Thanks, Gillian. We got most of it, but at the end, we did share with you the need for you to get in touch with Cambridge about the stability of their internet connection. So,
I am so sorry, guys. I do apologize.
Yeah,
there have been many things have been a tremendous shock. I have been forcibly reminded of the power of ritual coming into a place like King's College, King's Chapel. You know, the rituals and the sense of history hang very, very strongly on the place. And everything you said, Paul, everything you tried to teach me, Paul, about, you know, Durkheim, is really absolutely dominating my life right now.
Thanks, Gillian. You're loud and clear again now, and I'm sure that initial field work will stand you in good stead when it comes to the rituals. Right, welcome back in person again. Okay, now I think we're going to start the Q&A. We've got.
There is also, if you didn't see it, a message that Marion would like to say.
Oh, I didn't see that one.
Yeah.
No. Okay. So will you
yes, so
usher her into our presence?
Promote her
Yeah.
to usher her in.
Yes.
That will just take a moment.
Promotion is so hierarchical. Ushering in is more kind of sectarian.
Yeah. So I think you should be able to. Oh, there she. Okay, there she is.
Is she there? I can see at the
now.
top of the screen.
She's muted. Yeah.
Yeah.
This should work now. Yeah. Hello.
We can hear you. Wonderful.
Good.
And see you.
Great.
And given you're not in this country, bandwidth shouldn't be a problem.
Good. Yeah, just a few words. I'm delighted that this happens. The book launch was done and it's well attended. Clearly, quite a bit of interest. And I just want to say a few words. You know, of course, that disappointing sales of the first volume that did. But we are a victim, like so many British firms, especially export firms, of Brexit. It has been quite disastrous for us because it's so expensive now. But we have to add £30 to every book we export to the continent. It's just terrible. And of course, that deters booksellers or libraries on the continent to buy our books because it's so much more expensive. And then in the States, we have the problem, as you all know, the hostility towards the humanities and social sciences, the closing down of quite a few departments in the humanities, and also anthropology is suffering. But having said that, things are beginning to look also, and also our distributor in England went bust, owing us thousands and thousands of pounds, which we will never get back. So it is a very difficult situation at the moment, but as I said, things are looking up, and our ebooks are getting stronger and have the advantage that we can sell ebooks everywhere. You know, that's a good thing. So I'm optimistic. If I wasn't, Berkham Books wouldn't exist. So, and let me just say a few words about the series. That was my idea when I studied anthropology at Cambridge. Then, of course, we had to read all these famous anthropologists. And later on, when I had my publishing firm, I realized that more and more publishers publish these, as you will also know, a series of short books and introductions and so on. OUP are maybe the most famous. They have a very long-standing series of small, short introductions to this and that. And after then, I had my first few years ago. Then I think, what can I do? That seems to be where a lot of publishers go. What can we do? Then I was reminded of my years as an anthropologist when we had to do, to read all these famous anthropologists and write essays and whatever. And I remember I would have liked to learn a bit more about these people, but I didn't have time to read long biographies of them. So I thought, fine, why don't we do that and publish short volumes on these well-known anthropologists? And I mentioned that to Alexander Boscovich, who I saw his name, he's here as well, who responded quite enthusiastically and has immediately taken on the series and is editing it very successfully. And I'm tremendously grateful to him that he's doing it and that he is doing such a good job. He's very engaged in the series, and it's growing, and it's very well received. And I'm glad to say also the sales are better. And it's one of the few books where we come out, or series where we also come out with a paperback, which we normally try to avoid and first come out with an expensive hardback for libraries to get our money back. And then we follow up with a paperback. But in this series is well suited to come out with a split edition right from the beginning. So this is how the series came along. And thank you again, Alexander. There are quite a few titles now already published or in the process of being published or lined up, and we're waiting for the manuscripts to come in. So that in brief, a little bit of background information.
Thank you very much, Marianne, and thank you over the years for the support that you've given to all sorts of, dusty corners and minority subjects within anthropology. A lot has been published that would never have been published if Berkham hadn't existed. So we owe you a great deal. I owe you personally because you didn't mention that however badly Perri and Paul's books did, Jeremy and mine did ever so much worse. So thank you for not pointing that one out. Anyway, shall we? Thank you. Shall we move on to the questions now? Then I hope you stay with us for this, Marianne. I'm going to ask those in the room who are fall into three categories: people whose names I can remember, people whose names I can't remember but ought to be able to remember, and people whom I don't know, and I'm not always sure about the division between categories 2 and 3. So would you be kind enough to introduce yourselves, please, when asking a question from within the room? And I do have a question already on the screen from Tommy Matthew Hansen. So thank you for this book launch. I like the case Paul presented in relation to the civil war in Sierra Leone. My question to Paul and Perri is, how do they think Mary's perspective and their current book could help third world countries like Sierra Leone in dealing with shocks such as pandemics, epidemics, and climate change, please? Now, very conveniently, I had asked Paul whether he'd mind saying more about Ebola, and I'd asked Perri whether he'd like to say more about environments at risk, which climate change, I suppose, feeds into as well. So neither of them can claim to have been unprepared for a question of this sort coming up. So over to you, gentlemen. Who's going first? Paul?
Can I start? Because I'd like to acknowledge that Tommy's done a great job in Sierra Leone in establishing anthropology as a subject from almost a standing start. He's now, I think, graduated this last year 200 anthropologists in Njala University. And that the subject didn't exist 5 years ago.
So I hadn't cottoned on that he was a colleague of yours
Yeah.
in Njala. So great to have a question from Sierra Leone.
I would like to acknowledge that. Well, Tommy knows me very well, and he knows my Ebola book as well, so he can probably answer the question himself, but it's good for other people perhaps to hear. And it links to what Gillian was saying about the institutional failure to learn some of the institutional lessons of the Ebola outbreak and to translate them into the COVID outbreak. And Gillian and I have talked about this, and we wondered why, and she actually discusses them in her book on anthrovision. But I think the problem is it's this issue that Douglas raises that it's very difficult for people to see their own institutionalization. So the scientists that we're working with, the medical advisors that we're working with, and so on, they see themselves as belonging to a kind of international objective framework of knowledge. They are part of science. One of the things we try and bring out in the book is that Mary Douglas doesn't deny, she doesn't relativize scientific facts and findings. What she does relativize is scientific organization, because science only happens because it's socially organized. And when you look at the institutional organization of science, you cannot see any difference between that institutionalization and other forms of institutionalization. You'll very quickly find institutionalized racism within science. You'll find gender bias within science. All the problems that Douglas is pointing our attention to when she asks us to concentrate on how people think and not what they think, they become part of the problem rather than the solution. So in COVID, the real problem was that people said, or the scientists said, listen to the science, and then they marginalized all what they considered to be the daft stuff that was going on, and they didn't ask questions, why are people thinking those kinds of thoughts? If they had, they would have had a much better understanding of what the drivers of the epidemic were. By blinding themselves to the how of the thinking of the different groups and relativizing and not relativizing their own thinking, they weren't able to see that in fact they had to be much more subtle and effective in the way that they communicated. So it's not a question of laying on lectures in vaccine science. You have to understand why people would deny that there is such a disease as COVID. In Sierra Leone, as Tommy well knows, most people said there is no such thing as COVID because it's a common cold, and we've all had common colds in the past. And of course, that's the perspective you get in a country where there are very few old people. There are a huge number of young people, there's very few old people, and most of life, in any case, especially for the poor, is lived in the open air. So we know that the rate of transmission was much lower than it was in Europe. And then when most people got COVID, it turned into a common cold. And they said, this is no new disease, so why are we treating it as if it's Ebola? Ebola was a huge shock. They'd never seen anything like it, and its consequences are devastating. But when it came to COVID, their COVID denial wasn't really COVID denial. It was just saying that the evaluation that you Western scientists are putting on COVID is very different to the evaluation that we put on it. So if you actually want to stop it here, because we don't want West Africa or Africa reinfecting Europe, which is in effect what happened, because at least one of the variants seems to have spread into Europe from via South Africa. So if you don't want reinfection, you better understand how we are thinking about this and respond to that. So in the Ebola outbreak, one of my jobs was to try and persuade Chris Whitty that funerals did not cause Ebola. because that was the understanding the scientists had developed. The reason they thought that was because they looked at correlations. They found that most people who got Ebola had been at a funeral. And it took hard work, especially with Esther pushing this one. She was face to face with Chris Whitty on a number of occasions, telling him, this is not how we Sierra Leoneans behave. You're making a wrong assumption about funerals. The thing that is infecting us is that we care for our loved ones. The sick and the dying are passing on the infection, and that gives you a correlation with a funeral, because most of the people that we've nursed with Ebola have died, and naturally we've gone to the funeral. But your own correlations are misleading you as to what the causal factor is. The causal factor is that there's no preparation, there's no support for people who are caring for people in the last stages of Ebola. And Chris would argue with us, oh, well, they should go to an Ebola treatment center. We said, no. In the final stages of Ebola, it's too late. They're going to have infected even the very people that try and carry them to an Ebola treatment center. And in any case, people have then said, well, at least my loved one is dying, so at least let me be there at the end rather than let them go off into this death camp, as they saw them. Chris actually got his head around that for Ebola, but he couldn't get his head around it for COVID. And one of the things that I learned was that he'd been impressed by the performance of social scientists on the Ebola response. And when it came to COVID, he then went and did an extra master's degree in social science. But what he chose was to do the economics of health. He didn't choose to do medical anthropology. And I think the world would have been different had that been the case, because at least we'd have had one or two leading scientists who understood the nature of the argument that Douglas was making. So we're still hopeful that we can get through to that constituency, but at the moment they're impenetrable.
Okay. So if this one does go live, Chris Whitty gets a link sent.
Sorry?
If this one, when this goes
yeah,
live, Chris Whitty gets a link.
Yeah,
Perri, do you want to take up the climate change or broader questions of environment in relation to Tommy's question?
One of the first areas where people who studied under Douglas or were inspired by Douglas really began to develop extensive research was plurality and variety and disorganization in how people think about a range of environmental risks. And Douglas herself began this. So 1968, she produces this encyclopedia entry on pollution. And of course, it's a classic anthropological study on moral pollution. And somebody then asked her, I'm not quite sure who, Richard will know, don't you think we should be thinking about environmental pollution? And her first reaction, she says in the introduction to that section of the collection, Implicit Meanings, was, oh, that's a different subject. And then she realized, no, it's actually the same subject. So in 1970, she gives this lecture, Environments at Risk, in which she actually explores this and shows that the incompatibilities which make for misunderstanding between, for example, the African peoples with which she was much preoccupied and the ecologists were not necessarily due to believing different things about weather or anything. They were due to different forms of social organization. And she asks ecologists, and this was the phrase in the 1970 lecture, ecologists, to look at their own social organization. Where I think this went very quickly, and I think this is still useful today, actually, as a way into this, is thinking about time. And it was her student, Steve Rayner, who, of course, went on to become a world-famous anthropologist of climate change, perhaps the person who defined the social science of climate change for our generation, and who we sadly lost in beginning of February of 2020, who first began to look at the social cultivation of the perception of time. For example, who thinks things are so urgent that we've run out of time unless we make the most drastic changes? And who thinks, no, we still have time, we can adjust, we can develop new kinds of rules, new kinds of authority systems. And he went on with his very large number of postdocs at what was then the Institute for the Study of Science and Civilization at Oxford, to really develop this and apply it to a number of countries in Africa, Latin America, and so on. So I mean, he begins with his great critique of the Kyoto Agreement, and shows that using the Wallace and Gromit film The Wrong Trousers, he shows that this could only have come out of a highly hierarchical kind of perception, which just makes no sense. And actually, if we're going to address climate change, he argues we're going to have to get away from these kind of top-down imposed targets and caps and so on, because that simply will not work. What you're going to have to do is to find ways to unleash innovation and local self-organization, which will require the acceptance of a plurality of different ways of organizing. So what we need, he argues, is different kinds of settlements. And if you look at what his postdocs and students have gone on to do, they've begun to apply that. So, you know, you think about something like Johanna Kohler's work on water management in Kenya and a number of other East African countries. She's taken that and applied that to the great water conflicts, which are now so difficult in that country of lakes, as it's so often called. So I do think there is a whole program of work out there. It's not much in anthropology, it's in development studies. It's in science and technology studies, it's in political science, it's in business and management schools. And I hope that through the kind of work that Tommy is doing, we shall start to see more of this. But it's that attention to the social cultivation of different perceptions of time and of urgency, of the foreshortening of the past, the foreshortening of the future, or the lengthening of the past and the future, through which Steve argued, building on his work under Mary for his PhD, that we begin to understand why we cannot understand each other about environmental risk, and how mutual understanding will have to depend upon institutions of accommodation and settlement between different ways of organizing.
Thanks, Perri. I mean, I don't think it takes any of us long to figure out how we would roll out that kind of analysis towards Thames Water, Southern Water, Rishi Sunak's climate targets, and one thing and another this year. We wouldn't have to go far to find ourselves some productive field there. Can you bring Gillian back in?
Gillian can just
she's got her hand up.
Speak. I'm not sure she's going to use the camera.
There she is. Okay, go ahead, Gillian.
And tell me again if I freeze, and apologies if I do. Just wanted to add one tiny thing to Paul, which is one of the favorite stories that Paul told me about his amazing work was when he went in to meet with Chris Whitty in Whitehall, and Chris Whitty and others were speaking with absolute horror about the idea that when someone's died, you would want to go and touch the body in a funeral and have mass funerals in that way, touching the body. And it was presented as being something absolutely horrific and alien and primeval and opposed to everything.
Oops. We got to oppose to everything. No, are you coming back?
Had wild past to touch
Gillian,
Napoleon's body.
Sorry, Gillian. Can you remember what came after opposed to everything?
Opposed to everything that Europeans stood for. Can you still hear me? I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Carry on from there, please. You know.
Well, very quickly before the internet goes down again. Oops, it's found.
Not quickly enough.
Maybe she should cut out the visual.
Yeah, we'll try that again. Do you want to try switching the camera off again?
Yeah, I'm so sorry about this, guys. I'm deeply embarrassed by how bad the internet is.
Yeah, you're the head of this organization. Do something about it.
I know, I've only just arrived. I'm so sorry. Well, listen, very quickly, I was just going to say, if you...
Sorry, you're not going to say after all. I think you're going to have to type it in, Gillian, and we better move on, and I'll read it out if you don't mind. Okay, let me just take another one online before I go to the room. Oh, you're back. Do you want to give it one last go?
One last go before it collapses again, and wave at me if I can't see you. It was just to say that the irony was that the British were talking in horrified terms about the idea that West Africans had been touching bodies. And Paul, as he told me the story, pointed out that Napoleon's body had been brought to Whitehall.
Nelson.
Yes, after he died, after being pickled in brandy or whatever it was, and that thousands of British people had filed past at that time to touch his body too, and that was considered normal. And the point simply being that, you know, what is so easy to demonize as the other and as alien is often something which actually is, you know, not alien at all. And, you know, I think, Paul, you should tell the story. It's a much better story than I told it. But anyway, that was a wonderful, wonderful example of one of many of the prejudices that your work is trying to counter.
Terrific. You just got to the end of the paragraph before it started going haywire again. So
I'm so sorry.
Yes, let's not chance ourselves any further on that one. But thank you very much, Gillian. There's a similar story about Wellington going up from Walmer Castle, isn't there? All the way, Walmer Castle on the train up to London. But I'll spare you that one. Philip Smith asks, can the case be made that Douglas is too, in quotes, organisational due to her Oxford, double quotes, groupiness? Sorry, the thing you've just done, that's it. Sorry, you obscured the question for me when it said host has just spotlighted something.
Oh.
Sorry, Anine, due to her Oxford groupiness. And that we need two supplements. One would be a dive into the granular detail of folk reasoning, i.e. methodology. The other would be a look at the grammar of risk perception via a stronger model of cultural autonomy, i.e. the Aristotelian model used to explain climate change, war, AI risk perceptions, and why they vary cross-nationally, etc. Glad he's not asked me that question.
That's why I'm going to leave it to Perri.
Perri, you're the philosopher. Maybe you could tell us what is the Aristotelian model used to explain climate model, war, AI risk perceptions, and why they vary nationally. Because I'm not the author, I can admit to ignorance.
Let's start with Oxford groupiness. I mean, lots of people distinguish markets and hierarchies. I mean, you know, economists can do that right back to Williamson in 1975. One or two have added, you know, networks or Ushi clubs, whatever. One of the things that Douglas crucially did was to say, yes, but what about those who are strongly regulated, strongly socially regulated? What's a constraint? But very weakly socially integrated. So those who are not the Oxford groupiness at all. She goes through various ways of describing this, but her final settlement really from the 90s onwards, she calls this isolate ordering. She doesn't mean that people are lonely. She means that their bonds to others are very attenuated. And actually, I think this, far from coming out of her Oxford groupiness, comes out of her own experience of being somewhat a bad fit in Oxford in some ways, actually. And a lot of the work that has been done by people inspired by Douglas has really been to look at exactly that, and to look at why that explains very particular kinds of ways of perceiving risk and of using beliefs about risk. Paul must add his own, I think, hugely important studies on the moral economy of the isolates in West Africa. I mustn't summarize that, but I think it's a major development of Douglas's insights there. Philip asks whether the big difference is across national. I used to have this conversation before I retired with my students. I used to, well, I've no hair to tear out, of course. That went long ago. But you know, I used to get students who'd come along to me and say, "Oh, well, it's because of our Indian culture." Indian culture. How many languages are spoken in? I mean, how many religions are there in India? I mean, you know, the people of the Deccan and the entrepreneurs of Chennai and the bureaucrats of New Delhi, one Indian culture come off it. I don't buy, and Douglas never did buy, the idea that the big differences are cross-national. And on something like panic about AI, I think we do have to look at as much the differences within cultures. Now, Philip has together with Geoffrey Alexander, spent many years looking at the idea of the autonomy of beliefs. And I know this is a very important view for that school. Douglas, I think, was quite interested in that, but she would ask the prior question, what would it take for beliefs to be independent? What kind of social organization would make that possible, where beliefs would float free from the ways in which we relate to each other? How would people use beliefs if they were entirely disconnected from how they related? And one of the ways she asks that is to think about these people who are very strongly socially regulated, but very weakly integrated, because of course for them, well, beliefs are things that you can, come and go, aren't they? They're going to be pretty ad hoc. They're perhaps the people who are going to be most autonomous in relation to their beliefs, because beliefs are hand-to-mouth affairs in that kind of context. But is that how actually our big science wars or our big environment wars are fought? No, actually what we're looking at is much more kind of conflicts between different sectarian perceptions of risk. Even among people who believe the same propositions about climate change, but have very different views about, well, for example, urgency and time and how much time we have left and so on. And that's why I think I'm not inclined to follow Philip into the idea that beliefs on their own are a powerful causal force. I think Mary's insight that we should ask, well, what do people use beliefs for, is the key to some of it.
Just, that's what you're understanding by his citation of the Aristotelian model, which is that the beliefs themselves will be.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Philip
So
can correct me.
He can type in a response if that's
his
not
work,
what he's.
which is very important and influential.
Yes.
And Philip is a hugely prestigious sociologist of knowledge in his work on culture with both the sole author and with Geoffrey Alexander.
So I'll come, if he wants to type in a response, I'll come back to it in a few minutes after we've taken some other questions, because the answer you gave, I don't want you to answer this now, but just to put it on the table, takes me back to what was always an old query of mine with Mary's theories, and I never was quite sure where she stood on it because it varied, which was whether each person or household occupies only one position in all context in relation to being enclaved or not enclaved or whatever, or whether people can be very individuated in a workplace while very groupy when they go to a football match, and how these things play with one another. But I'll just leave that aside for the second.
I'd be delighted to come back to that.
But not yet, because there's a distinguished gentleman here to introduce himself.
I'm Dick Werner from the University of Manchester. I want to ask a question about the wrecker, not only because I read the Washington Post and one can't help but be aware that there are people who are so anti-institutional that what they want most of all is to appear on television as tearing things down. But also because I think that when The Reasonable Man came out of Manchester, there was also a voyage for Bill Epstein, who had been a big supporter of reasonableness and standards and written along with Max. And then he got to Melanesia and he found that it just wouldn't be helpful, because the thing that someone who was a big man had to do was to show that he was utterly unreasonable, utterly and totally given to making a destruction of the whole process. And what was most important was his sentiment, that he was angry, that he wouldn't accept anything going on. Now I wonder, is there really a Douglasian perspective on the wrecker?
Paul, do you want to take that? I'll follow.
I'm sure there would have been, but I'm not sure I know what it would have been. I mean, it's a very good question, Richard. So I think I would say that I would like having the time to think how to develop an answer in a Douglasian way.
I suppose one can think of at least two kinds of records. I mean, she studied people who wanted to tear down institutions. In the 1960s, she wrote a series of articles which are collected in The Active Voice, about anti-ritualists, you know, people who, despite, so going back to iconoclasts, and she looks at that as its own form of sectarian wrecking. But of course, to pull down a statue is a ritual of its own and is a highly ritualized performance. So there's that kind. The big man is a more interesting case because, I mean, those of you who are Melanesian experts will correct me, but I had always understood, and I may be quite wrong about this, that the big man, rubbish man system was a quite individualistic ordering. It's highly competitive among big men, and it's highly transactional. At least that was my understanding. Now, I may be quite wrong about this, so I leave those of you who know the literature there much better than I do to correct me. Now, in that context, the display of anger, as you say, becomes terribly important as a competitive strategy. Again, we ask, what do we use beliefs such as the ones we assert so angrily for? And I mean, I think it's quite interesting watching Mr. Trump compete with his rivals for the nomination for the Republican Party's presidential candidate. Asserting his fury, asserting his sentiments as a way to demonstrate his appeal in competition to his rivals. And I can quite see in that kind of highly individualistic competitive system where the display of fury enables you to mobilize certain kinds of support if your followers are differently organized, if they are, for example, highly enclaved, as some of the Republican sectarians are. And you've got to try and show not prophetic charismatic leadership, but you've got to show competition for fury. So what you've got is an individualistic competitive system among would-be leaders on primary ballots, but you've got a highly enclaved, embittered sectarian group that you're trying to appeal to. And I think in that context, that might make some sort of sense.
How do you cope with a guy like Geertz, not Geertz, but Geertz, G-A-E-T-Z, the House Republican guy who toppled the speaker in a Mary Douglas-like way?
I mean, that does seem to me a highly enclaved small sect on the hard right of the Republican Party. Clearly, you know, with its classic Douglasian foreshortened future, its Manichaean classification of the world into absolute good and absolute evil. And in that context, I mean, Mary Douglas wrote an article with Gerald Mars, published in 2005 in Human Relations, in which she explores how would-be leaders can survive in highly enclaved sectarian settings. And in that setting, the kind of great stunt becomes a terribly important part of demonstrating your solidarity with the enclave feelings.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. In a minute, Philip Smith has responded, but he responded after I noticed a couple of hands in the room. So I will take those first and then come back to his response at the back. You probably have to project because the speaker's down here.
I've got a sore throat.
Oh.
So I shall project that. So Francis Davies, I'm here from Birmingham. And my thing is public policies. I've just been loving this, and I'm thinking about your framework enriches someone like John Miguel's work, and you can put the two together and expand analysis in Africa. So just wonderful. But to really think about ritual, Eamon Duffy, fellow British Academy and historian, reads all of her output in the 60s as a secular contribution to debates around what's happening in the Second Vatican Council. In Richard's book, he talks about her very early formation in this total system run by these French-speaking sisters. And really what I'm just wondering is this truly a modern mind? Or if we're looking at the continuity of the institutions within her or around her, has she somehow sort of taken fragments of pre-modern frameworks where there's the proper authority of the market, the proper authority of the hierarchy, the proper authority of the state, the proper authority of the family, laid out in a kind of medieval framework by a Thomist and somehow sort of dragged or not lost some of that. A bit like Chinese decision makers still talk about thinking of China as the centre as their mother told them when they were 8, even though they're now 50 and in the leadership of the Commonwealth. Is this truly a modern mind when you work through all of her work, which I haven't? Or are there fragments there of something else coming forward from those early days or anywhere else?
I think she's synthesizing that experience as a very important part of her own institutionalization. And she comes back to it in a late article that Richard has anthologized, which was originally written for, I think, a Catholic theological journal, but then he's brought it into more general availability, called A Feeling for Hierarchy. I think that's an interesting piece to me, because it's after she'd had her, I wouldn't say conversion, but she became in later life much more convinced of arguments about feedback effects and interaction. Well, you mentioned it, Perri, already, the Goffman's idea of interaction ritual, that you initiate a process and that process unfolds and it has consequences in terms of the institutionalization of yourself and others. So I think she was very reflexive. And she was very conscious of her own position within an academic community and within a wider scientific global community, and that her own position had been shaped by particular institutional practices, and that meant she didn't have the authority to speak from the moral high ground and judge other forms of institutionalization. That's how I read that paper on A Feeling for Hierarchy, because in a sense, she shouldn't be admitting any on-level elements in the playing field, the hierarchy, enclave, isolate ordering, and markets, what we want to call it, individualism. These are all supposed to be part of her carefully engineered level playing field, but then at the end of her life, she's saying, but I have to confess, it's a confession. So she's a Catholic, confession is good for you, it's necessary. And she confesses to having a feeling for hierarchy. But I think all she's saying is that every analyst has got those, not necessarily feeling for hierarchy. She openly recognized that I had a feeling for enclave because I've been brought up as an extreme sectarian. And some of those things stay with you for the rest of your life. They shape your personality and your mentality and everything. So I think she was simply alluding to the fact that every analyst has to inspect their own feeling for whatever it is, and they need to be very careful about simply taking the idea of an objective analytical position and saying that's it. It makes it very difficult to know how to proceed, but she definitely outlines in some of her work on the late work on the Old Testament that there were ways in which you could use ritual creativity. So she uses the word composer quite a lot, and we've had a bit of an argument about whether Mary was musical, and I had several conversations with her on music, but she may have just been polite to me, but she seemed to know quite a bit about it. But her own family or one member of her own family asserts very strongly that she wasn't musical at all. But I think if you read carefully through her last book, The Thinking in Circles, she certainly had a feeling for poetic composition. So there's music, poetry, dance, these things are not separable fields. And she had a good instinct for understanding how literary form operated, and that was a reflection of patterns of institutionalization, because early novels she detected had got these circular constructions that she found in ancient literature. Those have gone in 19th century novels in Dickens and so on and so forth. And that is a reflection of changing circumstances of institutionalization. And then she's saying, okay, well, this maybe is this is a tool for intervention. If you understand ritual composition, whatever it is they teach composers, how to write poetry, how to write music, some teachers of composers say this is not something you can teach. You can only guide a composer. They've either got it or they haven't got it. They hear it or they don't. But I think she was suggesting that there were ways in which you could poetically engineer ways of presenting arguments so that other people could see your point of view more readily. And I took this very strongly in terms of the peace process in Sierra Leone, the idea of dancing concentric circles, that you can actually present within a ring dance, especially if you've got two groups and one is dancing this way and the other is dancing that way. You can present opposing points of view in a way that isn't involving a head-on smash. You can get people to appreciate that the other group have got their own perspective and you need to move around in a certain order. And I think the Northern Ireland peace process was a great example of that. And it's a pity she didn't live to write the second installment of her paper with Jerry Mars, because that analyses very clearly how positive feedback within enclave groups can lead to great destructiveness. But what she hadn't done was then write the opposite. How do you get out of that great? Because that was my problem. You know, we were in great destructiveness in the civil war in Sierra Leone, and how do we get back as quickly as possible to a relative peace? And the Parades Commission would have been a great example. She didn't allude to it, she didn't write about it, but we speculated that that would have been a great example for her, because the Parades Commission doesn't intervene in the peace process with any statements of its own substantive positions. It simply organises a calendar so that people they can't flaunt, they can't antagonise each other. They can have their parades, they can have their ceremonies, they can celebrate the Battle of the Boyne or whatever it is they need to celebrate, but they must do it according to a calendar that makes sure that they move around in some kind of integrated order instead of running into each other and having a great smash up on the streets. So it's an incomplete project, I think, but there's enough of a hint in thinking in circles of how some of these poetic compositional devices might work. And those would be the things that you need to start to apply to the sort of situation you've been talking about with Rishi Sunak and climate policy in Britain and all the rest of it. We need much more of that. Instead of the current politics is all about enlarging the scope of conflict, exaggerating the basis of conflict. And there's not enough of the ritual recomposition that would allow different perspectives to be seen in a cohesive and supportive rather than antagonistic way.
Yeah, if you want to see a practical example of composition of alternative points of view being put into place, read Risk and Culture with that in mind. And for those of us who knew Mary long enough to have known Aaron Waldavsky as well, yeah, the more hierarchical Mary became, the more market-driven Aaron Waldavsky's view of everything became. So they could agree about the framework, but they couldn't agree about, kind of what the outcomes of the framework were. And there is some stuff at Northwestern in the archives that I didn't look at when I was doing the biography and looked at subsequently, which Mary left there when she left the States, which is really amusing, of a sort of ticking him off for the extreme views that he puts in one chapter, and he responds by saying, well, you wrote that other chapter first and I disagree with it. And then they kind of pasted the thing together. It came out and everyone disagreed with it, because everyone could find one chapter which they didn't like at all. But
so
somehow
we should see it in ritual terms.
In ritual terms,
we don't
exactly.
read that book as a linear account. We just take it as a ritual.
Well, what you take is what you read in a linear account is that Mary, wanting the last word, then wrote a second book, not including Aaron Waldavsky. That's the linear account. Let me read Philip Smith's riposte before I take over the question from the room. The Aristotelian method. Risks are ramped up and down through a genre hierarchy as described by Aristotle in his Poetics and literary critic Northrop Frye. Facts don't speak for themselves. We can agree on that. Dangers, risks, consequences, justifications for action, modest or extreme, shift in systematic ways, not particularly tightly linked to morphology, but rather to shifts in public discourse and mood, political performance, e.g. UK COVID responses, not a big deal, like a cold, versus a new plague. So, I mean, I think what Philip's suggesting there is that there is a momentum within the discourse itself. which can be analysed aside from the social moorings that you guys would see as causal in the use of ideas. If I've got that, do you think that, is that more or less what he said?
If that's it, I would require a lot of evidence to show that it works.
Right. Well, he can get typing again in that case. I'm sorry, this is not a level playing field. The authors get to speak their riposte, whereas Paul Philip Smith has to type it and then wait for me to find a gap in which I can read it out. I think this is deeply unfair, but never mind. It is what it is. Okay. Next.
I want to get back to
introduce yourself, because
I'm Isaac Nias. I'm from Brunel University in anthropology. I want to get back to the point that we were talking about the poorly integrated individual and the anti-institutionalism, especially in the US. That reminds me of Hannah Arendt writing about loneliness and fascism, where she says that loneliness is also linked to anti-institutional breakdown and to this construction of community. And it's quite scary.
Mm.
And it's a breakdown of the working class and it's non-unionized labor, that insecurely employed non-unionized labor, where the Trump supporters come from.
I mean, I would support your point that I think, I don't know what Paul and Perri think, I think the isolate is the least well theorized part of the four quadrants.
We absolutely agree.
Mm.
And, we spent a bit of time trying to flesh out what might make a more plausible theoretical elaboration of that section with some segment with some empirical evidence that I've drawn in from some of the things that I experienced with the person I mentioned earlier, the late Steve Archibald, because he took me with him into some of these unsettled war zone areas where indeed we found the fragments of a Douglassian scheme. We found villages in which they basically become markets because they got relief supplies to buy and sell. And we found villages that were highly enclaved in which they wanted to give away food that was being distributed only to the members of their own community, not to the people who'd become detached from their own communities and were on the margins of the community as refugees. We found groups of wandering fighters that were still, in effect, running something like a marooned runaway slave kind of community who were almost genuine isolates in that they wanted to cut off all contact with the rest of the world. They would do things like preventing people from cooking during the daytime because the smoke might give away their position and all those sorts of things. So we found all the elements of the Douglassian mix, but scattered, broken apart. And then we were working on instrumental ways of bringing people back together so that they had the excuse or the need to interact and to develop some understanding of the positions of these other groups. So this was almost a practical experiment in trying to apply the Douglassian theory, paying particular attention to isolate ordering, because that was a troublesome group. If you didn't get the isolates to somehow work out how they were going to eventually integrate themselves with society, you would still have armed factions that were going to be almost random factors of violence breaking out without any possibility to control. So it became necessary to elaborate that sector, and I've since tried to write up some of that material. It's only the beginning. I think there's many, many ways, more ways in which we could exploit empirical sources to elaborate the isolate quadrant. But we do make the point strongly in the book that Mary at one stage wanted to call that quadrant fatalism, and then she realized that was undermining her own theory, because it offered some kind of emotional or psychological sentiment as a way of explaining what was going on. And she chose then isolate ordering because it was much more neutral. It spoke to the grid group conditioning. It explained that there were people who were strongly controlled by conditions, sometimes by other people, they're owners of slaves or warlords or whatever, but just sometimes by the sheer awfulness of the conditions they were trying to survive in. So they were strongly under constraints, and they didn't want to build lateral linkages because they didn't trust other people within their group. So it's a kind of emergence of a kind of organized anarchy in which they simply didn't have the, they didn't wish to be using some of the capacities, the organizational capacities of other institutional orderings. And that there was some potential longevity about these arrangements. We've seen the history of maroon communities shows that you can get some of these highly unintegrated formations can survive for quite long periods. And how they do it, we don't yet know. I mean, there's some, I've been looking at the material on Montagnard groups in Haiti in the mid-19th century. And these were groups of former slaves that resisted the efforts of the Toussaint Louverture revolutionaries to reintegrate them into plantation life, now as freed laborers. And they said, you know, screw that, we don't want unionization, we don't want anything, we want to go and hunt pigs in the mountains and live our own lives in the way that we want to live. And I think that's a rich field for gaining empirical materials. An extremely good recent book, I think it was a Cambridge PhD thesis turned into a book that describes in rich detail how those groups emerged and the way that they used certain kinds of secret societies that they retained memories of from West Africa. And these weren't the militarized secret societies. These were secret societies that were so secret that they denied the knowledge of what was going on to any of the members of the society. Anyhow, you can assess the evidence. I've published a paper on it in the Journal of Peasant Studies, and then there's that book. I'm trying to remember the author's name, but it's cited in that paper I just mentioned. So I think work is beginning, and I would love to see more. And I think we need a better account, so that she would be the first to agree that we had not developed the potential of the different institutional orderings. That was one of the problems with her theory, because everyone knew about markets and everyone knew about hierarchies, but very little had been done on enclaves and almost nothing had been done on isolate ordering. So it was difficult for people to see how the thing would empirically pan out.
Thanks. We're getting towards the end. I apologize if there are comments in the chat, but between having quite a big box that says Q&A and another box that has got the faces of Perri and Paul enlarged, and it's quite difficult to see what's happening in a very small box down near the bottom with chat. Have I missed anything from the chat that we really should have shared?
No, I think I've encouraged people to put things in the Q&A.
In the Q&A. Okay, I can see something from Judith Oakley there, but anyone else can see it after the event. So would you share? Thank you. Sorry, Judith, it wasn't that it wasn't important. It's that it's very small on my screen. I'm going to ask a last question. I can't see any more in the room, which is because we're actually out of time. Sorry, which is the old one. How do you account for the a prophet except in her own land aspect of Mary Douglas's legacy? I have been to not all, but many of Perry's University College seminars dedicated to the memory of Mary Douglas, and one of their most prominent characteristics is the complete absence of anyone who works in the UCL anthropology department year after year after year. There are political scientists and economists and health specialists and so on and so forth, but I look around for any anthropologists I recognize, let alone from the building in which the thing is taking place, and I don't see any. So what is it, either about Mary's theories or about contemporary anthropology or about the intersection between the two, that leads to this take up. I know it's a hoary old question, but that leads up to the take up everywhere except in anthropology.
Paul, would you start?
Oh, I've overstated it.
I would say postmodernism from 1985 onwards, which became any theory does. So people went off hunting their own favourite theoretician, and there was no attempt. In fact, they denied that there should be any attempt to create a unified or coherent set of. It had to be integrated, but you needed to know, what are the 3 or 4 major theoretical traditions within social and cultural anthropology, and I think that got thrown out of the window by postmodernism. There was anything goes kind of mentality for 20 years. But I think Mary probably made a rod for her own back, because she didn't suffer fools gladly. And I think she thought rather a lot of us were foolish. Perri and I were so foolish that she kind of just tolerated us as village idiots. We did, so long as we didn't raise awkward questions or anything, we just listened carefully. She was prepared to tolerate us. But and where that comes from, I think, is that the more I think about it, the more I looked at her early academic career, the more I think that anthropology really was quite a difficult environment for a woman working on her own. There were all sorts of issues that were raised about should she even be allowed to go to Africa to do field work, and she's only going to have kids, and why supervisors to do a PhD when she's going to be lost to the profession and so on. She had to live through all that, and I think it scarred her. And I think she was quite sort of, I wouldn't say revengeful, but it came out in this doesn't suffer fools gladly kind of thing.
2 sentences, Perri, if you want to. Or just say
I mustn't comment on the anthropology profession, but I would say the reception of Douglas in many other disciplines has been much friendlier, and I do wonder whether that hasn't helped within anthropology, actually, whether actually the recognition that political science and sociology and morality and science and technology studies and so on have really seized upon her has perhaps repelled. I mean, when I see citations by anthropologists of Mary Douglas, it's about dirt or it's about othering. And I think that speaks to some of the core foci of contemporary anthropology. And I think Mary got frustrated with trying to open up a broader set of questions about institutional dynamics within anthropology at a time when actually other disciplines were much more receptive to that.
Okay, thanks, Perri. So I will leave the potential readers with one thought, because I hope many of you will read it. It's my blurb on the back says it's a big book at short length. So you get a lot of ideas for your time spent reading. Mary did a Fontana Modern Master, which is a kind of ancestor of this ancestral series about Evans Pritchard. And some of the reviewers pointed out that the theories there were quite interesting, but they appeared to be the theories of somebody called Mary Douglas, which were foisted upon Evans Pritchard rather than Evans Pritchard. Now, so you'll have to read the book to decide whether you think these is Paul Richards and Perri Six's theories ventriloquized through the later works of Mary Douglas, or whether this is Mary Douglas speaking from beyond the grave, ventriloquizing Perri Six and Paul Richards. So anyway, there's why you should read it.
Surely we're dummies.
Okay, thank you everyone for contributing, organising, participating, presenting, and so on and so forth. Apologies, we're about 4 minutes over time, but given it's been a lively meeting, I think it's not too bad. And so I think we just say cheerio, don't we?
Yeah.
Haneen?
Yeah.
Cheerio. Okay. Thank you.